If you've ever wondered what happens when an entire galaxy decides that conquest should require proper documentation, look no further than the Dominion Accords, all 50,000 pages of bureaucratic brilliance that govern how civilized species wage war. Because apparently, somewhere in the distant past, the galaxy's greatest minds gathered together and decided that the real problem with interstellar conflict wasn't the death and destruction, but the lack of standardized forms. The Accords transformed warfare from messy business involving explosions and screaming into a refined administrative process. Want to invade a solar system? File Form 77B with the Galactic Mediation Bureau, pay the processing fee, and wait 6 standard months for approval. Planning to subjugate an entire species? Better hope you've dotted every I and crossed every T on your cultural assimilation impact statement, complete with environmental assessments and minority rights protections for the species you're about to enslave. The beauty of this system, according to its alien architects, was that it brought order to chaos. Wars became predictable. Conquests followed established timelines. Even genocide required a permit and a 2-week cooling-off period for appeals. The galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations had essentially turned warfare into the universe's most lethal filing cabinet. Which brings us to the current situation. The hegemony of Vorth, those delightfully thorough bureaucrats, with their crystalline exoskeletons and pathological need for proper procedure, had just completed their 17-year legal campaign to absorb humanity into their empire. Every form had been filed, every regulation followed, every bureaucratic hoop jumped through with the precision of a species that considered paperwork a fine art. The humans, bless their primitive little hearts, were scheduled for a compliance hearing on Nexus Station in exactly 47 hours. Standard procedure dictated they would review the documentation, file any final appeals, and then formally surrender their sovereignty with the dignity befitting a soon-to-be client species of the hegemony. It was all very civilized, very proper, and about to go spectacularly wrong in ways the galaxy's greatest legal minds had never anticipated. The compliance chamber on Nexus Station had been designed by committee, which explained why it looked like a courtroom had mated with a cathedral and produced offspring with severe anxiety disorders. Towering holographic displays showed the relevant sections of the Dominion Accords, their text scrolling past in 17 different languages, none of which included sarcasm. A tragic oversight, really. The Vorth delegation had arrived 3 hours early, because, of course, they had. Their lead administrator, Zekthara Prime Designate, presided over a table groaning under the weight of legal documentation that could have been used to construct a small space station. Behind him, lesser Vorth functionaries arranged files with the reverent care typically reserved for religious artifacts. When the human representative finally strolled in, 15 minutes late, and carrying nothing but a single, battered briefcase, the collective intake of breath from the alien observers could have powered a small atmospheric processor. Ezra Blackwood looked exactly like what central casting would order if someone requested a human who definitely knows something you don't. Average height, unremarkable features, and the sort of smile that suggested he found the entire universe mildly amusing, but wasn't quite ready to share the joke. He took his seat across from the mountain of Vorth bureaucracy, placed his briefcase on the table, and waited. Zekthara's vocal apparatus produced the harmonious tones that indicated official proceedings. Human Designate Blackwood, you appear before this tribunal to acknowledge the lawful transfer of human sovereignty to the hegemony of Vorth, as prescribed by sections 4847 through 4963 of the Dominion Accords. Do you wish to review the documentation before formal compliance? The other species representatives leaned forward with the anticipation of spectators at a particularly boring execution. This was always the moment when newly conquered species made their futile final appeals, demanded impossible concessions, or simply broke down in tears. Standard procedure called for patient explanation of why resistance was futile, followed by ceremonial document signing and champagne, or whatever passed for champagne among beings who metabolized methane. Ezra's smile widened just enough to suggest that someone was about to have a very bad day, and it wasn't going to be him. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone ordering coffee rather than discussing his species' enslavement, "I think there might be a small problem with your paperwork." The silence that followed Ezra's words had the quality of a held breath before an explosion. Zekthara's crystalline features shifted through several colors that probably indicated confusion, though they could have meant anything from mild irritation to the alien equivalent of a nervous breakdown. "Problem." The word emerged as a harmonic discord. "Human designate. The documentation has been reviewed by 17 separate legal committees across 12 star systems. The hegemony's claim to human territory is legally unassailable." Ezra opened his briefcase with the deliberate care of someone defusing a bomb, or perhaps arming one. Inside, instead of the expected legal briefs and desperate counter-arguments, lay a single datapad and what appeared to be a sandwich wrapped in foil. He took a bite of the sandwich first, because apparently even galactic politics couldn't interfere with lunch. "See? That's where things get interesting," he said around a mouthful of what looked suspiciously like peanut butter. "Your entire legal framework assumes we agreed to play by your rules. But here's the thing, and I really can't stress this enough. Humanity never actually signed the Dominion Accords." The chamber erupted in the alien equivalent of shocked gasps, which sounded like a symphony orchestra having a collective seizure. Zekthara's exoskeleton cycled through colors that definitely weren't in the good news spectrum. "Impossible. All spacefaring species must acknowledge the Accords upon achieving faster-than-light travel. It is fundamental galactic law." "According to whom?" Ezra activated the datapad, and holographic displays began showing human star charts, fleet positions, and what appeared to be 17 years' worth of military buildup. "While you folks were busy filing forms and following procedures, we were reverse engineering every piece of technology that wandered into our space. Turns out, when you're not spending 90% of your time on paperwork, you can accomplish quite a lot." The displays showed human fleets materializing across Vorth space in real time. Not the sleek ceremonial vessels typically used for compliance hearings, but ugly, functional warships that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of civilized warfare, and didn't particularly care to learn. "You see," Ezra continued, finishing his sandwich with infuriating calm, "we humans have this peculiar notion that if someone wants to conquer us, they should probably ask us first. And since you never bothered with that step, just filed a lot of forms with people who don't speak for us, we figured we'd respond in our own traditional fashion." The first reports began streaming in. Vorth administrative centers going dark, their bureaucratic fleets surrendering en masse to forces that treated proper procedure as a suggestion rather than holy writ. The humans weren't following any established patterns of conquest. They were simply showing up, politely asking for surrender, and when refused, demonstrating why compliance might be preferable to the alternative. "This is barbaric." Zekthara's harmonics reached frequencies that probably violated several noise ordinances. "War cannot be conducted without proper authorization." "Funny thing about that," Ezra said, standing enclosing his briefcase. Turns out it can. 72 hours later, the hegemony of Vorth formally surrendered to a species they'd never actually been at war with, using emergency procedures that had been gathering dust in the Accord's appendix for 3 millennia. The irony was so thick, you could have used it to armor a battleship. The aftermath sent shock waves through every civilized government in the galaxy. Emergency sessions convened on a dozen worlds, as species who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of bureaucratic conquest suddenly found themselves facing an opponent who treated their entire legal framework like an interesting but ultimately irrelevant historical document. The Nexari Compact immediately began drafting new regulations to address non-compliant species integration protocols. The Stellar Confederation formed a committee to study the committee that would eventually form a committee to deal with the human problem. Even the notoriously efficient Zephyrian Empire found themselves paralyzed by the simple question of how to threaten someone who'd never agreed to be threatened according to proper procedures. Humanity, meanwhile, settled into their new role as the galaxy's most accidentally successful power brokers with the bemused satisfaction of someone who'd won a game they hadn't known they were playing. They established trade agreements with species who were suddenly very interested in staying on their good side, mediated disputes between civilizations too bureaucratically constrained to fight each other effectively, and generally went about their business with the casual competence that comes from never having read the manual in the first place. The day humanity stopped playing by rules they'd never agreed to follow became a watershed moment in galactic history. Scholars would spend centuries analyzing how the most primitive species in known space had managed to outmaneuver civilizations that had been perfecting the art of conquest since before humans discovered fire. The answer, of course, was elegantly simple. Sometimes the best way to win a rigged game is to refuse to acknowledge that the game exists. The galaxy had spent so long making warfare civilized that they'd forgotten what happened when someone decided to be uncivilized right back. And somewhere in the depths of space, Ezra Blackwood was probably making himself another sandwich and wondering what other interesting rules humanity had never bothered to read.